expect. And so within the first two verses of what we're going through here, we're going to see very clearly that Jesus is going to switch from command to promise, from instruction to prophecy. In other words, from saying what you should do to explaining this is what's going to happen. So diving right into verse 16, I'll read it out loud, and the verses will be over my shoulder on the screen if that's helpful for you. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Right off the bat, he begins this part of his teaching by explaining this is going to get a bit ravenous. It's a bit of a graphic illustration. Sheep in the midst of wolves. I don't know how many of you ever seen those National Geographic videos of a predator pouncing on his prey and tearing into it. That kind of visual imagery, I think, is what's on the minds of the readers and us as we're seeing this sheep in the midst of wolves. In fact, the metaphor, sheep and wolf, that's not unique to this exact passage. Jesus has brought this up already just 3 chapters before in Matthew chapter 7, when he described false prophets as those who will come to you as sheep, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Actually, at the beginning of this passage, at the very end of chapter 9, it says that Jesus had compassion on the people he was serving because he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. The Gospel of John records that Jesus refers to himself as the good shepherd. This shepherding concept is rich in the New Testament and Old for that matter, and he's warning them of the wolves. And in a moment, he's going to explain who the wolves are. The next verse begins explaining it, as the next verse will say, beware of men. So he's making it clear, these are people just like you. We'll give further indication of who the wolf is a little later in this sermon. I'm going to send you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. So what do we do with a term like that? Wise as serpents, innocent as doves. I think Jesus is explaining to these disciples and to us by extension that we are to be wise and innocent. That is, wise, unfoolish, and guiltless, pure. The actual word there being used means exactly unmixed. No mixture of guilt and unguilt, but just pure and clean. Enter into your ministry in that sense. Wisdom and innocence. It sets the tone for the rest of the passage. You see, because Jesus is not merely going to say this will happen to you passively, but he's going to explain what you ought to do in response to those things. And so he gives them some commands, even in telling them what will happen. He, in effect, is telling his disciples here that it is good and right to strategize in evangelism for the sake of the kingdom. This is in a sense where God's sovereignty and our efforts see that they are not in collision. In other words, we don't say, well, because God is sovereign, he's in control, he has all power, he's able to do whatever, I don't need to worry about tact at all in what I do. I don't need to be wise or innocent. I can do anything, and God will take care of the rest. It's not what God commands. Conversely, it's not saying that the burden is exclusively on us, that if we mess up this command to go out into the world, if we don't say just the right things, if we don't give just the right arguments, if we don't convince somebody perfectly, then it's on us. We see both in play. So Jesus explains, be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. I want to give you a Bible example of this that I think might be helpful because this is so applicable to us. I want to give you a couple quick Bible examples, and then I'm going to give you one mission church example, okay? Great Bible example can be found in Acts chapter 16. The Apostle Paul had just been jailed in Philippi. In this region, he was telling the gospel to people, sharing truth to them, and they got uproarious, and they got all upset, and they actually dragged him off the prison, and they beat him, and they flogged him, and they put him in prison with Silas, his missionary partner. And as they were in prison together, even after having been beat, the text does not tell us that Paul stood up and pounded on the gates. How dare you do this to me? Let me out. I haven't done anything wrong. We don't hear that he and Silas cried out for their lawyer. Lawyer, I need my one phone call. None of that happens. But their response first It's in verse 25 of chapter 16. About midnight, while in prison, their feet had been fastened in stocks. They had been beaten and flogged that day. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Their first response was an innocence, guiltless, praising God for the fact that they had received their beatings. And what follows immediately after that is that God sends an earthquake to literally shake the grounds of the prison, break the chains and the bars off of their cages, to have their shackles busted from their feet, the stocks that had been fixed to their feet and then to the floor of the cell. They were able to get out. The jailer, the one in charge, was about to kill himself because he thought, oh no, the prisoners are leaving. I'm going to be killed tomorrow anyway. Tries to kill himself. Paul says, don't do this, and shares the gospel with that guy. He gets saved. His whole household gets saved. They get baptized that night before the sun rises. And then when it is day, the magistrates sent the police saying, let those men go. So they'd already beaten them. They'd already imprisoned them. Now it's time to let them go. They received their punishment. And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Therefore, come out now and go in peace. But Paul said to them, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No. Let them come themselves and take us out. Now, this is awesome. Because what we see happen is their first response is in perfect innocence. They're not angry, they're not shouting or anything, but they wisely, as wise as serpents, they play the card of Roman citizen at exactly the right time. Did you ever think, if you read this story before, Paul and Silas could have avoided A, imprisonment, B, the beating and flogging, and whatever else could have happened by playing that card before any of it happened. It was illegal for uncondemned, untrialed men to be beaten and had this type of thing happen to them. They could have played that card before it happened, but they didn't. Because they were wise and they were shrewd. And they waited till just the right moment so that they would get a safety police escort out of town and that the entire region would watch, oh, they were Roman citizens? And perhaps put pause to future endeavors to beat on Christians publicly for fear that they'd run into the same reproach. Guys, this is amazing. If right off the bat they had played that card, it is possible that the crowd itself, knowing that the magistrates wouldn't do anything about it, might have taken the law into their own hands or their own personal laws into their hands and tried to do something, and they didn't have that happen to them. They played the card perfectly. Now, they drew upon their shrewdness in this, but I think there's even a greater example of this in Acts 25. If you were to read through the whole book of Acts, there are 28 chapters of the book of Acts. If you were to read through each of these chapters, you'll watch God begin with a group of 120 believers in an upper room in Jerusalem. And you'll watch this cycle of epicenter being in Jerusalem slowly spinning outward in circles growing to reach the known world. And Paul's purpose throughout the entire book of Acts is to get to Rome, to swim upstream culturally, to get to the place of highest influence, to germinate that place, to let the rest of the gospel flow into the world. That's his hope. He wants to get to Rome. He wants to go upstream. If you actually trace on a map where his missionary journeys go, you see first one's kind of tight, and the next one swings out a little wider, and then finally a wider swing to reach even more people and make it to Rome. And how did he get there? He was beaten. He was prepared to be beaten, taken into custody, imprisoned wrongly by men who had said that he was doing wrong things in the temple in Jerusalem. And what he does is he plays his card perfectly and in perfect wisdom, standing before the governor, Festus, in Caesarea, he says, I appeal to Caesar. Now this is awesome. Because what he does in that moment is secure a military escort through the hardest reaches of the entire Roman Empire on his additional missionary journey to get to Rome on their dime with their protection to land exactly where he always wanted to go. Wise as serpents and innocent as doves. We're called to do the same thing. We're called to think and to act with the tactical precision. We have purpose. We don't just flippantly, well, God will work it all out. We can do whatever we want and it'll happen. No, we think through. We strategize. Guys, I get together with church planters and pastors all over Salt Lake County, Utah. We get together all the time. Why? One of the big reasons is to be able to strategize together and say, okay, where do we think would be most effective next? Where do we think God is leading us to go? In His providence, what do you think will be the next best course for us to take? There's a couple Bible examples. Let me give you a mission church example. I think that we should be tactical and precise and have a reason for why we do everything. And in evangelism, in the way that we talk, hoping that people who are not yet believers hear the gospel, I do some things specifically with a very intentional reason. Just one example for you is talking about Mormonism on Sundays. You guys know, if you've been here any length of time, occasionally, when the text allows, I talk about Mormonism on Sundays. This isn't something that's very commonly done in Utah. I don't think that's done a lot in Christian churches around that. Here's why. This isn't to flip it. I'm not just mad at a religion that's not the same as mine. I don't have a vendetta or an axe to grind. Here is why. I have 4 real reasons as to why. I'm just going to give you one reason today why I think that it's important and helpful for me to do this. I know that some of you are going to invite occasionally Mormon friends to church. Those who are active members in the LDS community. And we want that. We invite that. I expect and hope that that'll happen. And while I would never insert or remove something from a sermon that had been planned for weeks because of knowledge of somebody coming or not coming, I trust in the providence of God and who's going to be here on that day. I'll stick with what He's prepared on my heart to say that week. I know that it is very difficult oftentimes to talk about some of the major distinctions between Mormonism and Christianity in conversation. I know that because of good reasons, a desire to not needlessly offend, a desire to have good relationship with neighbors and friends, and conversations that could lead to gospel things, we oftentimes avoid some of the most important topics to talk about. I know this is the case. This is ultimately a good reason underneath why this happens. But I know that when a Mormon neighbor is invited to a Sunday service and hears from the pulpit a clear challenge to Mormon doctrine, that it provides opportunities for future gospel conversations, that if those same direct challenges were initially offered face-to-face from you to them, the Christian might not be given the chance to continue the conversation. I see it as an additional way that I, as a pastor, can serve my congregation, to provide inroads at an opportunity for you to talk with your neighbor who you've invited to come. That they would leave and say, I am never going back to that church. I can't believe you said that about Mormonism. And give you an opportunity to say, well, it wasn't you, it was me. You can pass that to me. What was it that he said that was so offensive? What was it that robbed your sensibilities? I would love to talk to you about that. You don't have to come back. Let's talk about that. I want to provide those opportunities for you. There's a reason, lots of reasons, but that's at least one. The Mission Church, we want to make strategic, practical, and tactical decisions we think will be helpful for you. Continuing on into verse 17, beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. First, what's interesting here is you are first responsible to speak the truth to the religious institutions around you. He's saying at least to these guys. And then to the government rulers around you. It's actually the full sphere of life. But something that he says here is that he gives a purpose. Why? Well, you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake. Guys, it's always been about Jesus. The issue has always been Jesus. Do you want to know the greatest obstacle to salvation for people? Jesus. Jesus. It's easy for us to lean on the side that is also true, to say Jesus is the one who provides and draws and does this amazing salvific work for people to provide and offer truth. But Jesus is the problem. sometimes I've been, when we go downtown and we talk to people about Jesus on the streets, I've not only had this for myself, I remember being there and hearing some people talk to Aaron saying the exact same things. Why do you think that by being on the street, and for the record, we're not standing there yelling, angry, hateful, you're going to hell stuff. We're, hey, can we share the gospel with you? Can we share the love of Christ with you? We want you to know the gospel if you've never heard it. This is a great chance. That's the stuff we do. And on occasion, someone will come up, do you really think that Jesus would approve of you coming? And we oftentimes mostly stand at Temple Square at the gate up there. It's a place where everybody in the city funnels through. Meet the most number of people there. Do you think that it is right for you to stand here at a temple and tell people things contrary to what this temple stands for? Guys, here's the interesting thing. The problem is not us in that moment. We're imperfect evangelists in anything, I'll tell you that. The problem there isn't us, it's Jesus. Think about the statement. Would Jesus go to a temple and challenge the religious institution around that temple? Would he? Except for the fields, he went more to the temple than anywhere else to tell the religious leaders, woe to you blind guides, you sons of Satan, you wicked men. He goes right there to do it. So the problem there is not that they don't understand what we're doing, is they don't understand what Jesus did. But with that in mind, we should not be more offensive than Jesus. We shouldn't say, well, Jesus went this far, so I can go this far. If something's going to offend somebody, let it be Jesus, not us. Listen, you can't. I have been a jerk in evangelistic situations, and then after a person walks away going, oh, what was I thinking? It's totally happened. And it's wrong, because I ought not be more offensive, stepping over the bounds of what Jesus would have said and would have done. Let Jesus be the one. For my sake, he says. That's why people will be pulled in. I never want to get put in jail because street evangelizing, I do something foolish, wrong, sinful, wicked that causes me to get put in prison. So I hope this would never even be the case, but example, I'd hope that in the moment of crazy arguing with somebody who's getting all hyped up, that I would never punch somebody. I don't think that I would do this, but I really hope that I would never do that. If I did, I would go to prison for me being an idiot, not because of the gospel. I want to have to stand before a governor. I want to have to stand before a king. I want to be brought before the religious rulers and leaders of the day. I want you to be brought before them for the same reason, for Jesus' sake. He says something else here. He says, and to the Gentiles, that they would bear witness before them and the Gentiles. Hold on for a second. If you were with us last week, verse 5, it says, Jesus' first words in this sermon, this discourse, go nowhere among the Gentiles, he says. And lest we think that Jesus never had it in mind to unite Jew and Gentile on a single course for salvation, unless we were to think that that'd be the case, Jesus makes this clear. It's always been in view that the Gentiles would hear the gospel proclaimed and that we would be witnesses to them. Verse 19, when they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Jesus does not promise his disciples that they will know what they will say before they get there. You notice that? But when? So the hypothetical, what would you do if someone held a gun to your head and asked you to proclaim Jesus? Occasionally, and in the past several decades, there have been a few times in Christian news circles that you've heard of stories of a gunman who comes in to shoot people in a college or a school or a theater. And on an occasion when that happens, sometimes you hear of them saying things. I honestly don't even know if the stories are true, but you hear that they ask, are you a Christian, before they pull the trigger. That's happened a couple of different times over the course of the past 2 decades. And oftentimes that causes Christians then to go, what would you say? What would you say? What would you say? I understand why we all feel that way. I feel that way too. I wonder a little bit. What Jesus is commanding right here is, don't worry what you will say. You want to know why? Because you and I will fail. Guys, we're not strong enough. But by the power of the Spirit, God will provide. He'll step in. And what we need to know for certain is we ought not be anxious about that coming moment. Don't let that be a cause for worry. Verse 21, brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. First here, Jesus brings up some of the closest possible human relationships outside of marriage you can think of. Brother to brother, father to child, child to father. Can we imagine people closer to us than those outside of marriage? Jesus does not merely tell us that betrayal will come. He tells us who they're going to come from. In fact, I think this really puts a personal touch on the opening passage of this sermon, which was sheep in the midst of wolves. It's not just outward forces, outside forces that are going to bring this, but those who are closest to us might bring this kind of persecution. I had one of the elders at our church in Naperville before Laura and I moved from Illinois to Utah. Before we came here, he was just giving us some counsel, some advice, some wisdom that he could offer. And one of the things that he had said to us in trying to prepare us for future hurts, struggles, and suffering, coming from his own personal experience, he said, what will surprise you most in life and ministry is not what will hurt you, but who will hurt you. And that stood true. What hurts more, the knife in the back or the hand that held that knife? Guys, we know, and maybe some of you from very personal experience know, nothing hurts more than it's from someone that you love and you know. Someone who you have poured into and cared for. A child, a parent, a brother or a sister. Jesus warns that this is going to happen at the hands of those who are the closest to us. What kind of persecution then is Jesus talking about? I think that it's easy for us as Christians occasionally to throw out the word persecution a little bit flippantly, quite honestly. I think we can do that if we're not careful. Flippantly talk about persecution every time we have a little trial or a struggle or something like that. And there may be a case in which that could be correct. Maybe when you get passed over for a promotion and you think it might be because of that one time you were talking to your boss about worldview things and realized that you collided a little bit. And so you think maybe that might be why I'm not getting a raise this year. Is that persecution? Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Your neighbors have never invited you over for dinner. After the first time you met them and you said something about you're going to a church or you're a Christian, somehow it came out. They asked what the cross was on your front door or something like that. Oh yeah, I'm a Christian. Is that persecution? Maybe. Maybe it is, but Jesus is giving a very specific persecution here. Let's review the list of what Jesus is saying persecution is here. What he says is, he says, according to these previous verses, delivered over to courts, flogged, dragged before governors and kings, betrayed, and death. Sometimes our kids say things that are a little bit dramatic in the moment. We do it. We see it really clearly in our kids. Little Bethany, about a week ago, We're about to have dinner. I came up from working in the basement 10 minutes later than usual. And she says, because she's wanting dinner, and her little tummy is grumbling, and it's been about 2.5 hours since she's eaten anything that we know of. And she says, I am starving. Now, come on, it is a parent's job. Guys, listen real quick. It's a parent's job to step in on those moments and be like, you're not really starving. Why? Because we want our kids to learn that heavy words like that shouldn't be flung around lightly. Because there are some people right now today who are starving. 15,000 kids in the world, kids, that's children, 12 and under, die of preventable diseases, mostly not having clean water and not having food, starvation-related diseases. 15,000 a day die from starvation. When you see the realities of that, it's really hard just to go, I'm starving, right? It's a heavy word. So I think that we should be very prudent to not use these big persecution words for little things. I would not want to stand next to a brother in Christ in heaven, in the kingdom of God, and him having been beaten, his family been burned alive, him having everything taken, stripped of him, praising God as he too dies a torturous death, and me getting passed over promotion and us going, persecution, right? Yeah, we know. I just wouldn't want to be that. So I wouldn't hammer too greatly, but just let's use those words for what they're used for. This is death being talked about, being hated by all for my name's sake. Next verse, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next, for truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, Jesus first is giving permission for his disciples to move on, and that sounds like what he's already said back in verse 14 earlier. If anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake the dust off from your feet, right? So you don't need to, by obligation, continue to beat your head up against a wall for the heart of heart. He gives them permission to move on next, but he attaches the permission in this verse to a reason. Why? Why do you have permission to move on when you encounter a hardened heart? He says, because truly, I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. I'll give you two things really briefly here. First is the one we can be certain about what this verse is saying. We can be certain that in so saying, and for the very reason Jesus is saying, he demands urgency in evangelism. We can see that's what he's saying here clear to the people. The reason you can move on next is because you ought to be urgent. The Son of Man's coming back. And judgment will follow. Now, the next part of this, I want to preface by saying, this is my opinion on, I think, what this verse is saying, okay? This next part I'm saying. It is possible that Jesus is, in this moment, referring to his second coming as a future reality, referring to the final and ultimate judgment going to be poured out on all peoples. That is possible. It is possible that as Jesus is saying this, he's explaining that the evangelistic endeavor to reach the Jews is going to take so long, it'll be a millennia-long thing, and the disciples who are the primary readers of this are not the 12, they already got this directly from Jesus, but us who today are reading this. And so it's instruction for us today about that very specific Son of Man is coming. And that the Son of Man coming is referring to the final and ultimate second coming of Jesus. That is possible, that's what this verse is saying. My opinion is, I don't think that's what it's saying. I think that the natural reading of this is that Jesus is explaining a coming of judgment upon the Jews that will come before these 12 finish their tour through Israel. I think it's talking about the judgment that is clear from the Bible is taking place, and we know historically in AD 70, the destruction of the Jewish temple. That was the time in which the age of the Jews unquestionably came to a close. I think that's what he's talking about. I don't think that when we see the term Son of Man comes in the Bible, they're always referring to the ultimate second coming. Sometimes they are, because it makes it very clear. Other times, it doesn't sound like he's talking about the ultimate final coming, which will be future. That's my opinion. I think that's the case. And so furthermore, I think this is why he instructs them to go first to the Jews. Why? They have a very limited amount of time in this age. Judgment will come, and thousands of Jews will be slaughtered in the lifetime of these disciples, many of these disciples. It's going to come crushing down on them. Their entire system is going to be destroyed. And so go to them first. The rest of the age to reach the Gentiles. So I think he instructs them to go first to the Jews because their age as the unique and exclusive people of God was coming to a close as Jews. I think that's the case. That's my opinion on this. But again, what we can be certain of is that Jesus is demanding a sense of urgency. Verse 24, then Jesus turns and talks about himself on this. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher, and the servant like his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? Really easy. He's saying, listen, you are my disciples, I'm the teacher. You are the servants, I'm the master, in the metaphor he's using here. And if they're going to call the master of the house Beelzebul, that word literally means Lord of the high abodes, the high places, the places like in the Old Testament constantly referred to as where demons were worshipped, the Lord of those high places. Now, other manuscripts sometimes change the word just enough so it says Beelzebub, and it's kind of a parody on Lord of the high abodes, and it's actually then referred to as Lord of the flies, almost in a mocking sense towards demons. The point is, if they will refer to Jesus as Satan, that's the point. If they would refer to him as the Lord of the demons, as the Satan figure, how much more will they malign those of his household? If they will attempt to mock and belittle the greater one, how much more will they attempt to mock and belittle the lesser ones? If he didn't evade that kind of attack, how will we? That's his point. Let me transition into application to close this out here together, okay? This instruction, beginning in verse 5, starts with victory. What's the first thing he tells them they're going to go do? Heal people. They're going to see miracles. So if you're hearing this sermon from Jesus, you're like, we're going to do what? We're going to do miracles? And then he gets to these verses, oh, and death. You're going to save the lives of others, and you're going to give your own. And this happens. It begins with victory. It now warns of death, betrayal, and loss. Why does Jesus warn his disciples of persecution here? I don't want to assume anything. I want to spend the last few moments teaching today on this. Why does Jesus warn us of persecution? I want to this morning give you 5 reasons why I think Jesus takes this opportunity to warn his disciples of persecution. And the first reason is this: because it is certain. It is expected and it is promised. Jesus is telling the truth then. Jesus cannot lie. He can't lie. Not only can he not lie, but he doesn't deceive. There's a subtle difference there, and explained by an illustration. When I was a teenager, not following Christ, I would sometimes go out with my friends after wrestling practice or football practice and do stupid things, foolish things. And I'd return home, and my parents, as good parents, would say, so what did you do? And I knew that I left from wrestling practice, and I went over to Brandon's house, and we sat around and watched a movie that I never should have watched, rewatching parts we definitely never should have rewatched. Got into his car, drove around a bit, joyriding, smoking cigarettes, because I thought that was cool, even though I coughs every single time I put one into my lips. Went back to his house to talk to a couple of other friends, and then eventually landed back at my house. So my parents said, what did you do tonight? I said, I went to wrestling practice. It was hard. Showered up, cleaned up, went back to Brandon's house. We watched a movie together, hung out with some friends, came back home. Did I lie? No. But I deceived. Because I knew that what they were looking for was what really went down, and I was omitting the very things that they cared the most about. I was deceiving. Not only does Jesus not lie, he does not deceive. He doesn't omit anything that you and I ought to know and need to know. Right? So this is why the Bible is sufficient. We don't need additional things, because not only is this not just Christianity 101 and the 102 course is in another book, not only is that the case, but additionally, if there were omissions of things profound enough to teach us of our nature, the nature of God and salvation and eternity, and they were to not be in here, this word would be deceitful. Jesus is not deceitful, so he tells us of persecution because it is certain. Reason number 2, why does Jesus warn us of persecution? So that suffering will not immobilize us. We must expect persecution as the rule and not the exception of the Christian life. When I was in the Marines, we did this one particular training with McMAP, Marine Corps Martial Arts. I was a martial arts instructor when I was in the Marines. And one of the things that they did with us is they taught us how to do knife fighting. We loved it because we'd seen lots of movies growing up where the good guy grabs the knife and turns it, and it's not how it goes down. I remember the first time we entered into the knife fighting phase of the teaching, and they had those little rubber knives. They were kind of like there was a rubberized shank, so you could be generally safe, not stabbed with anything sharp. He said the first rule, this black belt instructor stands up, the first rule of knife fighting is you will bleed. The second rule of knife fighting is you will bleed. And the reason he made a big deal about this and would furthermore explain is because when we see our own blood, it shocks us often. And sometimes it incapacitates us to the point that we can't do what we need to do in the moment that it most matters. And we go in expecting, I will see my blood before this is over. It helps us. It encourages us in that moment that when we bleed, our minds, our hearts, our spirit is ready for it in the same way Jesus wants us to not be incapacitated by the persecution that comes. Don't let it immobilize you. Expect it's coming. You know what? This expectation, it frees us up to not be over-fascinated by it. I had a really, really, really beloved friend of mine pass away this last week. For those of you who were with us when we used to go to our church services at the Adventure Church, the senior pastor of that church, Eric Van Ree, passed away suddenly this last week. Oh, that hit my heart. Guys, everybody is going to die. Everybody. And the knowledge of that certainty ought not drive us to look for it around every corner. But it ought to give us a piece of, I can live in fear or I can not live in fear. I can let it immobilize me every time I walk out the door to look for the meteorite that could fall on my head, or I can just enjoy the beauty of the day. It's meant to help us to not become over-fascinated with that idea. Don't marvel at the hatred of the world. And it's going to take a second, but just to stick this in, it's so important. I'm really good at identifying the hatred of the world towards us and talking about that. I think I do that. I think it's a natural thing for me. But we should not marvel that the world is going to hate us. We should not revel in the fact that they hate us. We should give them every opportunity to apologize. We should give them every opportunity to embrace truth in Jesus. And by knowing that the world is going to hate us and do these things to us, it helps guard our hearts against being hardened towards our earthly enemy. Reason number 3, why Jesus warns us of persecution, to keep us from being anxious about that persecution. He already said that in verse 19, right? Don't be anxious, because I will give you the Spirit on the moment that happens. So we know it's to keep us from being anxious about persecution. Reason number 4, to reverse the enemy's power in the moment of our greatest suffering. What is the purpose of our persecution? To say it this way, why does our enemy persecute us? Why does our earthly enemy persecute us? Well, Jesus said in verse 25, to malign those of his household. That word malign means it's the same as some of the other Latinized languages you might know. Mal, meaning bad, right? Malign, it's to make something evil. It's to vilify. When they malign, they want to make us the bad guy. They want to make us the evil ones. They want to make us morally culpable for bad and not them. They want to displace it onto us. This is the human plan. The Bible gives us very specific instruction about this all the way to Peter, who is one of the men listening at this exact teaching. And he writes in his letter, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, not if, when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. 1 Peter 3:15, he says a little later in the same book, speaking of when you suffer for Christ. But in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Okay? When you're asked for defense, be ready to give some kind of defense. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience. Why? So that when you are slandered, those who revile you and revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. That their attempt to make us look evil will in turn make them realize they're evil. Our persecution serves the persecutor. In fact, that's why our human enemy persecutes us, and it's how we ought to respond is with peace. But what about our spiritual enemy? So that's the purpose of persecution from a human perspective. What about our spiritual enemy, Satan? Moments of persecution are designed to rattle our resolve and to make us doubt God's promises. He wants to stop worship. So listen to this. While volumes have been written on this exact idea of tortured devices being created to make Christians say Jesus is not Lord, literally. This is why biblically and historically the response from Christians in the moments of greatest suffering is more worship of God rather than less. Jesus reverses the power. In that moment when suffering abounds, when persecution comes, those being persecuted don't go, oh no, God's power is waning. They're reminded by the words of Jesus, you will be killed. And they go, oh, even that promise is true. And we exult in those moments of how true Jesus was. It takes all the power from Satan. It robs him of any glory he might obtain in that moment, and it offers it instead to Jesus. This is why so many stories throughout Christian history have been of those being burned alive, and as the minutes, 10s, 20s, maybe even an hour or more being burned alive the entire time are singing praises to Jesus. Why? They can exult in and be reminded by this is even foreseen and known and promised by God. And he is made more true by this happening and not less. How many times has the torturer said, would a good God allow this to happen to you? And now a Christian says, he promised it would. It robs them of all power and gives it to Christ. In the moment we most need the comfort, we will be further reminded of his promises. And the last reason, reason 5, so that we would not waste our lives trying to avoid persecution. Guys, we need to expect hardship first because we're human. We're people. This world is imperfect. And second, we need to expect hardship as Christians because Jesus promises it especially to us. If you invest your entire life into tying the knots in multiple safety nets between the tightrope of your life so that if you fall, you will be protected, you will waste your minutes. We don't invest our lives in primarily building up insurance policies for our existence. And this is difficult, especially more so for, I think, Americans, Westerners than most. where every day we're taught and we're trained that when we wake up in the morning, our car is already warmed because we pushed the startup button before we got in to our enclosed garage. We get inside, and by the time we get back home at night, we lay down on our sleep number bed, and comfort from beginning to end. Comfort's not bad. I've talked about this in sermons before. Comfort is not innately bad, but an infatuation with it robs us of the right view that it will be difficult. I just want to close right now in a prayer, not only for you, for us as a church, for me, but for those Christians around the world today, right now today, who are enduring physical hardships and persecution, legitimate persecution, the kind that would make us never want to use that word in America. That God would empower and equip and give them the ability to see past the pains of this life and to fix their eyes on Christ. Let's pray. Father, we love you.